In this video, we're going to learn about how to create our character movement for top-down games. Now, let's just get back to our character on Prefabs, which is located on Prefabs Gameplay Player. And in here, we're going to add a component and we're going to call it a player character movement. And open it up on your Visual Studio, on your editor. So, as I said, this doesn't have the namespace, so we're just going to add it. Namespace and shooter.gameplay.player.character. And then we're going to close it off. And then we're going to remove the unused namespace here. Now, from the previous episode, we have talked about how to use the network callback. So we're going to change mono behavior to network behavior. So anything that is a network-related simulation, we are going to use network behavior. Now, by default, network behavior has a lot of functions that we can use, such as the network fix update, render, start, reset, and destroy. And there are a lot of them, but for now, we're going to use the network fix update. So network fix update is called depending our tick rates. And tick rates can be edited on here, which is the nettick settings, and that's here. And we can change the tick rate here. So currently we have 33. So 33 means that this fixed update will be called 33 times in 1 second. Now let's get back to our character. So for this tutorial, we're going to use a rigid body here. And then we're going to create a field for our rigid body. And we're going to call it rigid body. And then let's collect our input using the float. Let's say horizontal. Input.get axis horizontal. And with this one, we're going to call it vertical. And then let's move our rigid body. In here, we don't want to use velocity because it's much depending on Unity fixed update. So instead, we're going to use a transform. So rigid body.transform.position will add to the velocity here. So let's create a velocity. And we're going to create a new field here. We're going to call it a move speed. And let's set the move speed, let's say 10 or 5. And then we create a new here. So for this one, we have X, which means the horizontal. And meanwhile, for the Y, we're going to set it to 0 because we don't want our character to jump on the air. And then we put it vertical over here. We're going to put our velocity here. And don't forget, the velocity needs to be multiplied by the move speed, and we also need to multiply to sandbox.fixed delta time. Now, fixed delta time is the time between each steps or between ticks. So currently we have a 33 tick rates. Now, 33 tick rates is equal to ticks per second. Now, this equal to how much delta time? We can know the value by using 1 divided by 33. So in calculator, that equals to 0.03. So this will be the delta time. So I'm just going to close it off, go back here. So why do we need to multiply the fixed delta time? So let's imagine we don't multiply by delta time and we have a really high tick rate. So basically this call frequently, that means that our character will move much faster. So to make it much normal, we multiply by using the fixed delta time, just like the Unity delta time. And then save that off, and we're going to go back to Unity. And then we go to the inspector here, going to add the rigid body here. And let's add a floor. So currently we don't have a floor. So I'm going to create a cube, set the transform to 10, or let's much bigger, maybe 20. And 20 over here. Let's add our player. Oh, we don't need to add player. We're just going to go click play, run server, There we go. So we have our character over here. It works perfectly. Now there will be issues with this setup. First off, we need to set the player rotation here. So we don't want to use any rotation except the y-axis. And then we do want to use the gravity. And then we're going to also freeze position on y. So basically, we don't want our character to travel like this. Now, to set up our character much correctly, in networking games in general, we want to separate the visual and the important things such as the simulation like collider scripts and stuff. So go ahead and create a empty object here. I'm going to call it a pivot. And then we're going to remove this mesh renderer and the capsule here. So what can we do is just going to copy here, paste, and then we're going to copy this one too, and paste. And then we're going to remove the capsule here. Then we're going to have our visual here. It's separate from the player character. Now we want to our pivot visual to be much on the upper. If we change our pivot here, like our mode, the Gizmos mode, we have center and pivot. So we want to use pivot because when we click on our player character, that the pivot point is on the bottom, which is the player feet. Now we need to adjust the collider 2 here. So let's just the center to be 1, like this. And that's all good. Now there's another thing that we want to talk about. Currently, the player position will not that work across game sessions because we currently do not sync any positions. So we can use a network transform or we can use a network rigid body. So this is pre-built by the Netic and it asks for a render transform. So render transform is basically just a visual purpose only. So basically that means our pivot. We can just drag in there. Why do we need to populate the render transform? So this is from the previous episode we had talked about interpolation. So the pivot will interpolate smoothly so it will not affect the main character. So let's say our player move over here and the pivot will slowly move from here to here. So that's what it's do. So let's go back and let's have to click play. And you might notice that there's an issue currently with here. So the player has this position. However, the visual, the pivot here is on the bottom. So when I move the pivot, it snaps, it's locked. So one way to do this is that we create empty parent. So I'm gonna add the name as pivot. Meanwhile, we're gonna change this to visual. So what does this do? That the pivot will be snapped into this position, but the visual won't. So let's try to click play server. So let's click our player again. Should be 1. Oh, my bad. So we have to change the render transform here. So let me open the prefab again. Change to pivot. Gonna server. There we go. So our player now standing on the correct position. So the collider and the visual matches. Now, yeah, there's a little bit issue with the floor that the floor is not on the correct Y position. So when I set this to 0, I'm going to change the floor to minus 0.5. That's it. Now we have a working player character. So I'm going to change the floor again. Alright, now that works. However, there's an issue with this. So let me try to build a game using a client build. So let me just click a build and run, which is using Control B. So here were my second window. So let's try to run server on the editor. We run server successfully. And meanwhile, for this one, let's try to run client. And we have our player character here. So when the server moves, it also moves the another player. However, when we are on client, we can see that our character is struggling to move when I press A, S, D, and Y. Now, this is the nature of a Netic input transfer authority. So we cannot use this kind of stuff. And why do you see that the host also moves the another player position? because host or the server has the authority of everything, so it can move the rigid body position. Now, this is not the intended way. So one way to do this is we create another script. Let's call it local input provider. So I'm going to call it a local input provider here. Open the script up on your Visual Studio. So just remove the namespace again. Add your namespace here and shooter.gameplay.input. And this we need to derive from the network events listener, similar to the match manager that we created previously. So we need to override on input here. So on input will be called for each Unity frame. Now in here we can copy this, put it here, and it seems that there's a namespace error here. So I think we don't want to use the name input here. So let's change that up to player or game input. All right. So they doesn't collide with the namespace. And now we can use sandbox.setInput. Now setInput accepts a T or a generic data type. Now let's create our input structure here. So let's create a public struct. I'm gonna call it player input with the interface of network input. There we go. And then we can put what input we can send to the server. Now we have a horizontal and vertical. So we want to move let's call it a horizontal and vertical. We can send them this, or we can just use a vector tool of move axis like this. Then just make sure to make it public. Now let's create our input here, a player input equals new. And then this input going to have move axis. I'm gonna create new horizontal and vertical, and then just gonna put the input over here. And I'm gonna click save. And then in here, we're going to use a read input by the Netic. So we have sandbox.fetch input. We have we have this fetch input. So this method is available inside the network behavior. So we're going to call fetch input out, and it accepts a generic 2, which is our player input here. Out player input. Now this fetch input is a boolean, so no worries. So just gonna create a if nested here, and then we're gonna copy this and put this inside here. So now it asks for horizontal and vertical again. So don't worry, just gonna put it again. Horizontal equal to player input dot move axis dot x. Meanwhile, for this one, vertical, our player input dot move axis dot y. And let's go back to Unity and let's try to test that out. So let's try to play server, and we can just move like usual. So what's happening here is when we call sandbox.setInput, we're sending the input from our local machine to the server. And let's try to build this for the client build. I'm going to click Control B. So I'm just going to click play here, run server. We move like usual and click on run client, and we can also move. So what's happening here is that we are sending input from this window to the editor, and then the editor moves the player character. So that's what was going on. So now we can collide with these guys, and meanwhile this guy can also move too. Alright, now before we end this video, we're gonna clean up some stuff. So we're gonna change cube to floor, and then put the scripts. I'm gonna put it here. So we have gameplay and stuff. So player character movement is for player. So we're gonna create a new folder, player, and then I'm gonna call it a character. So just gonna put our player character over there, and then we have also another local input provider. So I'm gonna create a folder input. I'm gonna put it there. Now there's also one script that we need to separate, which is the local input provider. This one. So we don't want this to be a namespace. We want this to be a separated class. We don't want this inside of class. Well, that's just for a clean code. It's optional, but I just prefer to have a much cleaner code. So make it a player input. There we go. And then we're gonna move our local player input here, copy that, and paste it in. So we're gonna make a namespace here, .gameplay.gameinput, and click save, and it should be saved too. I'm gonna remove the unused namespace. I'm gonna compile, and it says that there's another error here because of the namespace. I'm gonna remove this, and then there's an error because the namespace conflict. So I'm pressing the Alt Enter by Visual Studio that it can autofix using this button. All right, now this should do. Let's try to run the quick test again, run server, all good. All right, so let's recap what we have done for this video. So this video we have learned how to send input from client to the server, and then we also use the network rigid body, and we have learned about how to separate visuals and simulation objects on our player character. All right, see you guys in the next episode.